So the fifth project, advised by Professor Rosen, is the Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021. Chandana Yelker is our presenter, and if you're ready, let's take it away.
Am I audible? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So good morning. I'm Chandana, and I'll be presenting the midterm briefing on behalf of the workshop group on HR 5 and 6, Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021. Firstly, I would like to thank our advisor, Professor Rosen, my output team, Anika and Anupama, and the rest of our workshop group. So today we'll be going over the problem of environmental justice that the bill is addressing, the objectives of HR 5 and 6, the program design option that our group has chosen, and finally a summary. So HR 5 and 6 is addressing the issue of environmental justice, and the bill defines an environmental justice community as a community with significant representation of communities of color, low-income communities, or tribal and indigenous communities that experiences or is at a risk of experiencing higher or more adverse human health or environmental effects as compared to other communities. In the United States, the environmental justice communities have historically faced a disproportionate impact of environmental hazards. So this can be seen from the graph here that it represents the percentage of pollution exposure to the environmental justice communities. As you can see, Latin Americans are exposed to 63% more pollution than they produce, and Black Americans are exposed to 56% more pollution than they produce. And this is in comparison to non-Hispanic white Americans who are exposed to 17% less pollution than they produce. This problem is only aggravated by the lack of a comprehensive database identifying environmental justice communities. There are several national and state-specific databases such as the Census, CDC, etc. But they exist independently and in a scattered manner, because of which it is very difficult to use them to identify all of the EJ communities that exist across the United States. But with the existing efforts that have been taken place, the EPA, through its Environmental Justice Program, has awarded more than $29 million to 1,400 community-based organizations, tribal governments, and Native American organizations. But there are so many neglected communities still awaiting federal aid. And these are the issues that the bill is trying to address. So to get a context of the bill, HR 5 and 6, Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021, was introduced by Cori in January of this year. It was referred to the Committee on Energy and Commerce and Natural Resources and the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change. And the objectives of the bill are to form a mapping committee that consists of 28 federal agencies who will each be responsible to collect data pertaining to their departments. For example, the Department of Health and Human Services can provide data pertaining to childhood leukemia, rate of lead exposure, etc. The work of this committee will be based on the feedback received from local stakeholders like environmental justice communities and organizations. And the committee itself would be headed by the EPA. And another objective of the bill is to form a mapping tool that will be used to identify all the environmental justice communities in the US. And this will involve aggregating the data collected by the mapping committee on several socio-economic and environmental indicators, and would also entail development of a data repository to store all the data that is collected. In addition to this, a bill has allocated a funding of $20 million for implementation in the first 2 fiscal years of 2021 and 2022, and for the subsequent 3 years, it is $18 million, with the aim being to incentivize funding for the environmental justice communities that are being identified. On the whole, the implementation in the first year after the enactment of the bill would entail formation of a committee, development of a methodology for creation of the mapping tool, development of a methodology for identifying and addressing data gaps, which would again end in a formation of the data repository. Now let us look at the program design option that our group has chosen. Initially, the program designs that we developed were a political urgency approach, a data-driven approach, and a procedural equity approach. And our group has chosen the procedural equity approach because it is highly focused on community-based engagement to ensure inclusion of all environmental justice communities in the national database. So the procedural equity approach has a hiring strategy that focuses on both in-house and outsourced workforce, and it places a special emphasis on GIS specialists, that is Geographic Information System specialists, who are pivotal for the creation of the mapping tool, as well as DEI, that is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion contractors. The structure in this approach would be concurrent in such a way that the mapping committee would work alongside an advisory council, with the advisory council not just having a consulting role, but a managerial role in the entire decision-making process. And the committee responsibility on the whole would be to develop the mapping tool with the approval of the advisory council. Now here is a brief representation of the organizational structure when it comes to the procedural equity approach. As mentioned earlier, the implementation body would be headed by the EPA. So the EPA in its administrative role will coordinate the work between the mapping committee and the advisory council. The mapping committee, as mentioned earlier again, is responsible for data collection and mapping that will be carried out by the 28 federal agencies involved. And this mapping will be based on using DI contractors and GIS specialists. On the other hand, the advisory council will be made up of 50% members who are representatives of environmental justice communities. And this council will direct the implementation step for data collection and identification of environmental justice communities by working alongside and closely with the mapping committee. So the main implementation steps when it comes to this bill are data collection and resource allocation. So when it comes to data collection, the procedural equity approach utilizes a community-based participatory research method to ensure that all the environmental justice communities are included in the national database. On the other hand, resource allocation in this approach would ensure that the advisory committee will direct the funding allocation to ensure that the most pressing concerns receive the utmost funding. So just like any other approach, the procedural equity approach also has some pros and cons. One of the major advantages of this approach is that it is the most equitable to the environmental justice communities, mainly because of the extent of their involvement in the creation of the mapping tool. For example, EJ Screen is an EPA tool to identify the environmental justice communities, but it has 11 environmental and 6 demographic indicators. But the problem is that the data is only updated once in 3 years, and also it does not have granular data when it comes to the rural areas. So we believe that using a community-based engagement approach will overcome such barriers. Another advantage of this approach is that this approach provides an important role for the advisory council. This will ensure that their experiential input can be used to overcome and close the gaps that exist in the current databases. Another advantage of this approach is that it can help establish trust of the environmental justice communities and ensure proper reparations. On the other hand, this approach has one of the major disadvantages of being most cost and time intensive. This is because a community-based engagement requires immense input of time, money, and labor. Another drawback is that finalizing and obtaining a consensus on the methodology of developing a mapping tool as well as a methodology for identifying and addressing data gaps can be very difficult, mainly because of the number of stakeholders involved in the decision-making process. Finally, to summarize, the procedural equity approach and our bill will ensure that the environmental justice communities have easy access to data to organize and fight for justice. This is because Empowerment of the environmental justice communities are integrated into every aspect of this program design option. So in continuation, next week we will be focusing on organizational contracting and staffing plan. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Hey, Chandana, really, really awesome job. My question goes back to the beginning of your presentation when you talked about how certain racial categories or groups pollute more than they take in, which is a very bad way of summarizing what you said. But how do they define the polluters? Will it be like a company with a majority, let's say, white board, or is it based on like a CEO? I was just curious how that breakdown went about.
Okay, so first of all, identifying the environmental justice communities itself and defining them is itself not an easy process because it is not defined on the whole. So there's a definition given by this bill. If you look up somewhere else, there'll be another definition, right? So that itself is a difficult process, but I think on the whole, the way they define that is by the location that you are at, and I think the income levels and your spending, so all of that would sort of give an estimation of what you're using, and then it could relate to how much you would be polluting. And like you also mentioned, I think when it comes to the CEOs and like the big organizations who are placed maybe near the locations where these communities are housed, again, that would again show that these sort of like organizations who mostly employ maybe the majority population would be polluting the area where the minority population is located. But I do not have a definite answer to that yet. Thank you.
I had a question about the mix of like just combining new data or like existing data, because obviously like some of this stuff will just come from the Census Bureau or the Health and Human Development Department, and then some of it you suggested was going to be like new data collection. So what do you think that breakdown is between like we're just trying to like centralize existing data versus we need additional data? And then a follow-up question is like, who are going to be responsible for that new data collection? Like what organization and who's going to be performing that work?
Yeah, so first of all, the breakdown would depend on the past data and the new data that would be collected. Would, again, like I mentioned, the first year would be mainly focused on identifying where there's a data gap, right? So there you will be able to identify what's already existing and what is then required. And this approach mainly is focusing on a community-based participatory method approach, right? So that is because we have seen that in the current databases that exist, there is ample data, but again, there is again a lot of drawbacks because it is not very inclusive. So what is already collected is maybe based on census, CDC, etc., and several agencies that are part of the federal government. But then we also want to sort of include outsourced workforce, sort of like have an outreach program and go to the ground level and sort of like have a participatory method to sort of like talk to the people and then gather data. So that is also a focus of this program. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Really fantastic job. My question is just asking for a little clarification on the organizational flow chart. So it seemed to show that information is flowing into the EPA from both the mapping committee and the advisory council. So can you clarify in that case what the specific managerial tasks of the advisory council would be?
Yeah, so the whole of the implementation body is headed by the EPA, but in this approach, we are giving a very high role to the advisory council, and obviously they will be sort of pivotal in directing who should be contacted, how is the data collection to be implemented, and how do we contact the community members and get that sort of input, right? So that is the sort of information that will be flown from the council to the EPA too. But that is the main role. So we want to ensure that this council does not just have a consultancy role where it's like they give some recommendation, but that is not heard of or not implemented, but sort of making sure that whatever they say is taken into account, not just taken into account, but implemented. But the whole of the structure would be sort of like, the main head would be the EPA anyway. So. Yeah.
Oh, that was the question. Okay. Do you have a question? Oh. Yeah, I'm just wondering how you plan on integrating stories and interviews and testimonials into your larger map.
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Oh, sorry. Well, first, great presentation. I forgot that part, so redo. But my question was how you guys plan on integrating stories and testimonials and interviews and surveys that you do in your local projects with the larger map.
Okay. So that design is not yet developed. So we have only thought of this, and then I think in the future weeks we'll have a more concrete plan. But then the idea is that if you start talking to communities, you will know who has been already included in the database and who has not. And I think that's a very complex procedure in itself and will take time, which is why that is one of the most disadvantageous aspect of this program design. But we want to go ahead with it because even if it is difficult, it can produce very good results. So, but then we still have to see how to implement that. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, first, all excellent presentations. So let's give our briefers another round of applause. So what I'd like to do at this point is bring you back again to where we started, which was looking at the science of these programs, which is what we spent the summer doing, and now taking these bills and looking at them again in terms of what piece of this can we actually get started with. So you go from a fundamental understanding of what is the issue, what's the problem that we're addressing, what's the solution, what is the scientific basis of it. And so again, all of these environmental problems have a scientific element. What I thought was really interesting today was that all of these programs also have a diversity, equity, inclusion, and access element to it, which I thought was brought out in each of these briefings, and I applaud you for that as well. And I mean, the final brief, this last midterm briefing, the whole bill is about that, but I mean, all of these bills, all of these environmental programs have been, the groups have focused some attention on these issues, which I think is something, if you look at the midterm briefings a decade ago, you would not have seen. And you can look at them on our website if you really want to. What I see here in the group is real progress in trying to get your arms around these bills and really understand what are these programs about. And you know, the phrase that's often used is cutting problems down to size, because you can't do everything at once. The forestry group certainly had a humongous bill to deal with, but all of these bills have huge elements, and you have to start somewhere. So the second half of the semester is going to focus it even more narrowly about startup. You know, a lot of people are interested in entrepreneurship and business startup, and that's an emerging field of study. But government program startup is also what the second half of the semester is about. So how do these programs relate to what's already there? How do they relate to not just what's there in the federal government, but at the state and local level and at the community level? How do you really make this real? And so the second half of the semester is really going to be focused on those very practical day-to-day issues that every public policy analyst needs to think about as you think about what's feasible and what's real. You know, we've seen, and just to give you a couple of examples of the Biden administration, an approach to immigration that is not working at the border because nobody's paying attention to the details. A withdrawal from Afghanistan, which has been seen as a fiasco because those management and organizational issues were not focused on. Lots of discussion in Washington about the policies and the values and the politics, not enough about the on-the-ground operational issues that make things real. And that's what the second half of the semester is about. And frankly, if you don't get to that, none of the other stuff matters. And so in order to make policy real, we have to focus on these really prosaic operational details that are not fun and are not, all that intellectually, path-breaking. This is really old-fashioned, boots on the ground. What are we going to do day to day to make this happen? And this is also why sometimes what is promised in Washington, people in communities never see, because the design itself doesn't think about the reality, and somebody's not paying attention to the day-to-day. The last example I'll give you is when Obamacare started and the website crashed. Okay, what undermines your credibility more than a detail like that? And so, again, that's what we're going to be focusing on the second half of the semester. And it may seem like this is prosaic stuff, because it is, but this is the most important thing I think you're going to be doing while you're in this program, is focusing on those issues and hopefully learning something. So again, congratulations. These program designs were thrilling to hear. Really excellent presentations, uniformly excellent. And I congratulate you all. And I guess your reward from that is muffins? Is that what we... Say it again? If you want to stay, Stephanie's going to take some photos of groups, if you want, on her camera, while I go and steal the muffins. So thank you.